Are the suburbs getting worse? Now, the suburbs are complicated and there's lots of ways to measure them, but for this video, let's call worse disconnected. Are there more loops and cul-de-sacs that don't really lead anywhere, and are neighborhoods just very separate? I asked this question several years ago and actually conducted my own study, collected data, and as of last month, published the results in the Journal of Urban Morphology. What did I find? Well, before I get to that, I want to tell you what we already knew. Now, I'm geeky enough to have my own favorite journal article, and it's the Evolving Metropolis by Michael Southworth and Peter Owens, and it was published back in 1993. And it's just a great study of this question exactly. The best part may be this graphic here. It breaks down suburban street patterns by decade. In 1900, just before the streetcar suburb era, cities in the US are spreading using the gridiron plan. In the post-war years, streets have largely eliminated four-way intersections, leading to what these researchers called fragmented parallels. Every decade after, the street patterns become more curvilinear and more filled with cul-de-sacs and loops. The authors further count things like intersection density, which is a way city planning researchers quantify walkability. The more intersections, the smaller the blocks, and the more pedestrian scaled the city. We can see that the number of intersections per 100 acres declines precipitously. Access points to neighborhoods also declines, making it hard for residents to leave their neighborhoods. This is classically illustrated like this. Imagine living in this house and wanting to visit your neighbor, one you share a back fence with. In some cases, you might have to travel miles to get there. Cul-de-sacs are also associated with walkability or the lack thereof. Cul-de-sacs are great for people who don't want cars zooming by their house. They only offer access for the people living on them, no through traffic allowed. Loops are basically cul-de-sacs, only useful for those living there. Again, Southworth and Owens see cul-de-sacs increasing and walkability decreasing. I think all of these trends make sense to anyone who's given more than a moment's thought to how street patterns have evolved over time. I personally love studies that confirm our instincts about the places we know. But you may have noticed that the last decade they recorded is 1980. I'm old, but even I wasn't born in 1980. A lot has happened since then. The principles of the new urbanist movement were set to paper in 1991. This movement has been influential in having us rethink how suburbs are designed. New urbanists have built suburban communities that are generally more walkable than past neighborhoods. We've also become more aggressive in our policies related to reducing carbon emissions to stave off climate change. Policymakers now recognize that suburban land use patterns can contribute to climate change. Traffic has also become worse, and the kind of street patterns that typify suburban development are partially to blame. So with all of these trends popping up since the Evolving Metropolis was published, have the suburbs gotten better for walkability and bikeability? I'll tell you what I found after the bike bell. To answer this question, we need to venture to a place where there's been so much sustained sprawl that there's enough data for each of the decade buckets from the 1950s through the 2010s. Where can we find such a place? Well, there are certainly many large cities in the US with decades of sprawling development patterns. For this study, I chose Wake County, North Carolina, home to Raleigh. Raleigh is the principal city in the Research Triangle region of the state with over 2 million people. It's also one of the fastest growing areas of the United States, which is perfect for my study because I'm measuring sprawl. I had to figure out how to date street patterns to specific decades to understand how they contributed to walkability over time. I did this using subdivision data. Here in the United States, cities grow out not lot by lot or block by block, but by subdivision. A subdivision means a larger piece of land that is divided into housing lots by a developer. The developer also must design a street network for the new neighborhood and provide services like a sewer system. Most people have heard of the zoning ordinance, but the subdivision ordinance governs the design of these new neighborhoods. Anyway, Wake County, North Carolina provides freely accessible subdivision boundary maps with dates. I could then look at the street networks within those subdivision boundaries and know when they were built. Subdivision boundaries were also helpful to have because the Evolving Metropolis counted access points to the neighborhood. And I could do the same thing by counting the number of times the streets intersected the subdivision boundary. For those curious, I did this all using GIS software, which is basically a way planners and researchers can put data on maps and compute things spatially. In addition, I used Python to automate the computation of all of my statistics. This was definitely necessary as I computed statistics for street networks for 1,010 subdivisions. I'm pretty sure that the previous study did not use this many subdivisions, as I think they had to count by hand. Okay, with all of that out of the way, what did I find? Well, if you compare my trends from the 1950s to the 1980s, the trend lines match up with the Evolving Metropolis research pretty well. This is good news for both of our studies and lends some additional validity to the findings. This narrative that the US became more car-oriented in the post-war years, and it shows in our street patterns, does hold true. But what about the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s? Surely we've made progress and our suburbs are more walkable than ever before, right? Well, it's complicated. First, the not so good news. Cul-de-sacs have never been more popular as they are right now, or at least in the 2010s when the study ends. Now, it's not so much higher than the 1980s, but there's definitely not a downward trend. We still love our cul-de-sacs. But let's get some good news, okay? Intersection density is higher, and the trend is very clear. You can see it in this example subdivision. I chose it because it's the most average subdivision statistically for the 2010s in Wake County. It almost looks grid-like within its neighborhood boundaries. Lots of intersections. The last statistic I want to point out is access points. In the 1980s, the number of access points to a subdivision bottomed out at an average of 4. That has essentially remained unchanged to this day. You can see it here in the same 2010 subdivision. There is currently 1 connected access point and 3 more stubs to be connected to other neighborhoods when they're built. But if you look around Wake County, you'll find neighborhoods where the stub access points never got connected and just ignored, basically. My study counted this neighborhood as having 4 access points, but it may functionally have 1 for decades or forever. So the results are a mixed bag, but I think it would be hard to argue that suburban street patterns have gotten significantly better over time. Why is this the case? Well, it's hard to know exactly just based on my data, but I do have a few hypotheses. I also happen to measure the size of subdivisions and found out that they've been getting smaller over time. Subdivisions today are 33% smaller than they were in the 1950s. Yet you have more lots per subdivision than ever before. In the 50s, lots were bigger, the neighborhoods were bigger, and the streets were spaced further apart. It's like developers took the same ideas and started shoving them into smaller and smaller subdivision boundaries. When you do that, intersection density goes up. I also noticed that subdivision boundaries have become more irregular over time. I didn't measure this, so this is just based on me staring at 1,000 subdivisions when I was doing the research. But my guess is that many of the prime large parcels got subdivided early, leaving more marginal neighborhood sites by the 2000s. Cul-de-sacs are pretty useful for getting road access to a narrow subdivision, and it might explain why we still see them used so heavily in suburban street patterns today. I'm also not a big cul-de-sac hater, so the increase in cul-de-sacs isn't super worrying to me. I actually think that you can do suburban street patterns with cul-de-sacs well. Michael Southworth, the guy who co-authored the original study on this, also co-authored a cool article called Rethinking the Cul-de-sac, which makes the case for incorporating shared use paths with cul-de-sacs to create quiet streets for cars, but grid-like connectivity for pedestrians and cyclists. I actually studied that solution with the shared use paths in my dissertation. Maybe I'll make a video about that too. It may not surprise you, given the fact that I have now 2 studies that directly piggyback off of Michael Southworth's work, that he was my dissertation advisor back when I was a PhD student. He didn't tell me what to research. I'm just that big of a fanboy that I went to where he was a professor and studied there. Anyway, I think that the lack of change in access points is the most disturbing trend in suburban street patterns. I mean, the increase in intersection density is nice, but it doesn't really matter if you never leave your neighborhood. Part of the problem is that these suburban subdivisions are almost 100% houses. There are some HOA clubhouses, but it's almost universally housing. So if you want to get anywhere other than a neighbor's house, you have to use an access point to get there. And with fewer and fewer of them, they're less convenient for pedestrians and cyclists and create a lot of indirect routes. If we want to get people to ditch their cars for bikes, we need to make clear, safe, and direct networks in the suburbs. That means more access points and safer arterial streets. Most of the access points for subdivisions don't lead directly to other subdivisions, but instead connect to those busy arterials. In Wake County, where I studied, many of these suburban arterials are former county highways with high speeds, drainage ditches, and not much space for active transportation. It's a recipe for crashes, and most sane people won't want to walk or bike on them. Okay, so what can we do to improve walkability and bikeability in the suburbs if these are the trends we're dealing with? I think the first thing we can do is amend subdivision ordinances. Subdivision ordinances sit next to zoning ordinances in a city or county's codes. They govern the process and design of subdivisions. Mandating more access points could create more connected suburbs. If enough neighborhoods connect to each other, pedestrians and cyclists can avoid busy arterials. You could even cut these connections for cars and just require path connections between subdivisions if car-through traffic is a concern. Second, you could capitalize on natural features, abandoned railways, and other alternative linear spaces to create path systems to allow longer distance travel between neighborhoods. There are efforts like this underway across the United States, and many places also have so-called rails to trails projects. Perhaps the most famous is the Atlanta Beltline, a 22-mile path loop around Atlanta constructed from 4 former rail lines. The Beltline connects dozens of neighborhoods and connects to other trail systems, multiplying its usefulness. Robust, long-distance path systems are also commonly used in Europe to connect cities and villages, allowing cyclists to use them almost like highways. If US suburbs had similar long-distance path systems connecting neighborhoods with plentiful access points and internal path systems designed with cul-de-sacs, you have the makings of a pretty great alternative suburban transportation network. If cities go even further and allow for denser housing and mixed-use development, then residents can access even more destinations on foot or on bike. All of this leads to a gradual shift that could get people out of their cars and onto the trails. So my study really only looked at suburban street patterns, not the types of streets themselves, but that can make a big difference in walkability and bikeability in the suburbs. In fact, I've done a whole video on that very topic, and it's available now on Nebula. You can go sign up and view that right this second. I always post my next video first on Nebula, so anytime you see a video posted here on YouTube, my next one's already up over there on Nebula. Because we're filled with thoughtful creators, we have some pretty smart features built into Nebula. First of all my videos posted on YouTube are already up early on Nebula. That means you can sign up for Nebula right now and watch my next video without waiting a few weeks for it to appear on YouTube. That's pretty great already. Nebula also has no ads, making the entire viewing experience better for you, and it also makes it better for the creator because we're able to produce Nebula original series that can focus on being great instead of being great at pleasing the YouTube algorithm. These are passion projects that answer the question, what would videos from great creators look like if they had more resources to do that thing? 2023 was a great year for Nebula Originals. I even put out a Nebula Original series called Great Cities that profiles some of the most influential cities right at the inflection points that made them great. You can learn about why Venice built canals and why New York built Central Park. It's some of my best work because Nebula provided additional resources, and it's only available there. There is so much great exclusive content on the platform right now too. The ever popular Jet Lag series starring the crew from Wendover Productions and Half as Interesting. For those who don't know, it's like a travel game show that's incredibly addictive and tailor-made for anyone who likes my channel. Real Life Lore continues to publish excellent episodes of their Modern Conflict series. Real Science has a series where 2 amateur naturalists try to survive using only tools from the Paleolithic. In all, Nebula offers you, the viewer, an ad-free experience filled with videos produced by a curated group of thoughtful YouTubers. And those thoughtful creators are also publishing big-budget, high-quality exclusive content. And you get all of this for a surprisingly affordable price. When you sign up at my link, nebula.tv/citybeautiful, you get 40% off an annual subscription, which brings the cost down to the equivalent of $250 per month. My channel will even get a portion of that subscription fee as long as you say subscribe. So it's one of the best ways to support me and this channel. If you want to go above and beyond, we offer lifetime memberships for $300. You pay once and never again. This is a great way to support Nebula and its mission. We're full of independent creators, and by taking on investors like you, our viewers, we can become one of the most premier streaming platforms completely differently than our competitors do, by self-financing thanks to support from people like you, people who support the vision. I love that we can offer an affordable monthly membership plan for some folks and allow other folks to go above and beyond and again, support the mission and this channel. So we've got early access, no ads, prestige content, and more coming down the pipeline. Now's a great time to sign up. So go click on the link in the description or on screen to get 40% off and support this channel. Thank you so much.